The Battle of Philippi was over, and more than 30,000 Romans were dead, all at the hands of their fellow citizens. And the victors in that battle, Antony and Octavian, they didn't stick around, but parted ways. Octavian marched back to Rome and that city's seemingly insurmountable list of problems. Elites were furious that their land had been confiscated and that their taxes were high and that, several thousand of them had been murdered by Octavian and his co-rulers Antony and Lepidus. And the poor in Rome were mad too because the last surviving son of Pompey the Great was using his fleet of ships to keep Rome from getting the grain necessary to feed its population of more than 500,000 people. Well, Antony ventured over to the east, and he was on a mission to loot, pillage, and punish any foreign ruler that had helped Brutus and Cassius. He was joined by none other than Cleopatra. This was just the beginning of a tragic romance that would not only influence the fortunes of Rome, but would change history forever. So let's get back into the story on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 5, Mistress of the East. The triumvirate was victorious, but it had lost its unifying purpose. And with no more enemies left to fight, the Roman Empire was left in the hands of 3 warlords with massive armies and territorial monopolies. Mark Antony had the East, the entire East. Octavian ruled over Italy, and Lepidus moved over into Africa to secure the grain supply. This left Spain alone, and Octavian claimed those Spanish provinces as his own as well. Italy, as I alluded to in the introduction, was a shambles. What with all the land confiscations and taxes and murders, and then Octavian returned from Greece only to demand more of the Italian people. He needed to take more of their land because he had to give it to the veterans who had just defeated Brutus and Cassius at Philippi. The triumvirs had made that promise, and it was up to Octavian to steal the land that was necessary to keep that promise. But this latest exaction was really too much, and the Italians had 2 sympathetic advocates at the highest level of the Roman government. One of the 2 sitting consuls of that year, 41 BC, was a man named Lucius Antonius. That name sounds familiar to you because he was the younger brother of Mark Antony. And Lucius and his sister-in-law, Fulvia, and that's Mark Antony's wife, who was also in Rome, they took a little trip into northern Italy to show their sympathy for the poor, exploited Italians. And then when Lucius and Fulvia returned to Rome, what did they come with? You know how this story works by now. They came with an army, 8 legions worth, about 40,000 men. So Octavian had been beaten at his own game, but he had far more troops to call upon. Soldiers who had no qualms about fighting other Romans. They had just done this in Philippi, and these soldiers owed Octavian their loyalty after he had kept so many of his promises to them. It was a big disadvantage to Octavian that he had to settle those veterans, but it was also a benefit to him because those veterans depended on Octavian and would therefore come to fight for him when he needed it. And boy, did he need them now, because Lucius and Fulvia had taken Rome. Now, very quickly, Octavian was able to mobilize his forces and kick those 2 and their army out of Rome, and then they became cornered in the central Italian city of Perugia. And there they waited, Fulvia and Lucius Antonius, in the hope that Antony, brother and husband, would send soldiers to bail them out. Now, historians don't know whether Antony was secretly behind that insurrection the entire time, or if he just found out after they had put it into play. Either way, Antony refused to lift even a finger to go and rescue them. And had he done so, he might have actually won that conflict. Octavian had lost the support of many elite Italians. That was the whole cause of this problem to begin with. Also, one of his consuls in Lucius Antonius, and Antony, of course, had a very large army of his own over in Asia Minor with him. But Antony decided to leave his brother Lucius and his wife Fulvia to the mercy of Octavian. And despite the seriousness of the insurrection, Octavian was surprisingly lenient once he starved Perugia into submission in early 40 BC and captured the pair that had caused him so much trouble. First, he let them both live. That's pretty remarkable in and of itself. Lucius was sent to Spain, and then he just disappears in the history books. We don't know anything else about him. Fulvia, however, was exiled from the city of Rome, and then she just happens to conveniently die of an illness, we're told, only a few months later. Now, why was Octavian so merciful with these two? Well, either Octavian believed truly that Antony was not behind the insurrection, or he recognized that even if Antony was behind the insurrection, if Octavian were to punish Fulvia and Lucius Antonius, wife and brother of Mark Antony, Antony might be obligated, whether he wanted to or not, to send his army over there for vengeance. Octavian was not being merciful because he was weak. He was being smart and strategic, and it would not be the last time, by the way, that Octavian avoided the kinds of visceral, emotional reactions to various slights or setbacks that would come to wreck the careers of so many Roman elites, and as we'll see, Roman emperors as well. Antony, meanwhile, had totally lost his wits over in the East, at least if the ancient sources can be believed. It began several months before Octavian captured Antony's brother and wife, back in October of 41 BC. Antony was in the ancient city of Tarsus in Asia Minor. He was summoning kings and queens accused of supporting Brutus and Cassius, basically in order to shake them down for money and for various favors. And one day, into his court strolled Cleopatra, descendant of one of the legendary generals and successors of Alexander the Great. Cleopatra's Greek ancestors had taken Egypt as their personal kingdom, substituting themselves as Egyptian pharaohs. But these new Greek pharaohs really threw themselves into the role. They even adopted the incestuous tradition of brother-sister marriages to guard the line of the pharaoh. So Cleopatra was actually a product of centuries worth of inbreeding. And modern media tend to portray her as beautiful, as a seductress, but the surviving images of Cleopatra on coins and stone busts and probable paintings that we see in places like Pompeii actually suggest that her countenance was fairly plain and unremarkable. They might have called her handsome in the early 1900s. Her face seemed to be marred by a large hooked nose and a chin that jutted out slightly. So no Elizabeth Taylor for sure. No, ancient accounts claim that Cleopatra's real charm was her intellect, her wit, and especially her charisma. So here, for example, is the Greek writer Plutarch. Quote, Cleopatra's beauty, we are told, was in itself not altogether incomparable, nor such as to strike those who saw her, but conversation with her had an irresistible charm, and her presence, combined with the persuasiveness of her speech and a character which was somehow diffused about her behavior towards others, had something stimulating about it. There was sweetness also in the tones of her voice, and her tongue, like an instrument of many strings, she could readily turn to whatever language she pleased. It's Plutarch's biography of Mark Antony. Cleopatra was an exceptional reader of other people. She listened and she learned. In fact, she knew somewhere between 5 and 10 languages. Of all the Greeks to rule Egypt, she was actually the very first one, after several centuries of rule, to actually learn the native Egyptian language. And she had this almost chameleon-like quality to be whatever was needed to exert her influence on the men around her. She figured out Antony right away, and Plutarch tells us that. This is what he reports. He says, Cleopatra observed in the jests of Antony much of the soldier and the common man, and adopted this manner also towards him, without restraint now, and boldly. Again, Plutarch's biography of Antony. Cleopatra saw Antony for what he was, a soldier at heart, jovial, crass, a man who knew how to have a good time. So even while Antony's wife Fulvia and his brother Lucius fought Octavian in the insurrection back in Italy, Cleopatra was at the same time convincing Antony to go with her, not to Rome, but back to Egypt, further away from Rome, where Plutarch tells us they wasted the days away, playing sports, feasting, going shopping, and basically drinking themselves into stupors in the court of the pharaoh. Now, some of you will know that Shakespeare, 1500 years later, in his play, Antony and Cleopatra, would call Cleopatra the Mistress of the East. But the ancient sources suggest a feminine moniker like that could just as easily belong to Mark Antony. Cassius Dio, who was a Roman senator that wrote in the 3rd century AD, he is one of several ancient commentators to claim that Cleopatra so charmed and dominated Antony that it was in fact she who took the traditional male leadership role, and it was Antony who submitted to the passive female role. Antony, in other words, was mistress of the East. Here's one of Cassius Dio's most vivid passages, and I'm just quoting a little bit of it, where he described Cleopatra handling most of the leadership duties when the two of them were together. Quote, Cleopatra enslaved Antony so absolutely that she persuaded him to act as gymnasiarch to the Alexandrians, and she was called queen and mistress by him, had Roman soldiers in her bodyguard, and all of these inscribed her name upon their shields. She used to frequent the marketplace with him, joined him in the management of festivals and in hearing of lawsuits, and rode with him even in the cities, or else was carried in a chair, while Antony accompanied her on foot, along with her eunuchs. That's Cassius Dio's History of Rome. That last line is especially damning. Everything prior to that is talking about Cleopatra taking on various management roles, and Antony yielding the decisions to Cleopatra. But in that last line, Cassius Dio portrays Antony as being relegated to walking among the eunuchs. He's literally among the men with no testicles. Okay? There could be no greater insult to the man who once summoned a riot at Caesar's funeral, drove his opponents from the city, the guy that defeated Brutus and Cassius in battle when Octavian was sick, a hero of Rome, a man who just a few months ago was punishing kings and just sleeping with their queens. That man had quickly become thoroughly emasculated by Cleopatra. That's what Cassius Dio is trying to tell us. But Antony could never marry Cleopatra. She was a foreign woman, and a man of his status, a Roman man, a co-ruler of Rome, a man with unprecedented power and authority. A guy like that had to have a proper Roman wife, and his old wife was conveniently dead. So in 39 BC, Antony finally sailed back to the west, and he met Octavian in southern Italy. And there the two men formalized that new distribution of territory that I mentioned earlier. Antony getting the east, Octavian getting the west, and Lepidus being stuck with a contested Africa. And they sealed their alliance with a marriage. Octavian gave his older sister Octavia to Antony to be his wife. After the wedding in Rome and just a little bit of time together, Antony abandoned his new wife in the city, and then he sailed back east, back into the arms of Cleopatra. It would be the last time that Antony would see Rome. 2 years later, 37 BC, Octavian and Antony renewed the triumvirate that year, another 5-year term for all three of them. Of course, at this point, it's really Octavian and Antony, with Lepidus almost an afterthought. Also in 37 BC, Octavian and Antony agreed to an exchange of soldiers. Antony needed infantry for a land invasion of Persia, and Octavian needed sailors and ships to fight Pompey Sextus in Sicily and finally lift the grain blockade. Antony's ships arrived promptly, and Octavian's general and best friend, a man named Agrippa, decided to work with Lepidus, and the two of them were able to ultimately defeat and kill Pompey Sextus and free Sicily. But to which victor would go the spoils, Lepidus or Octavian? In 36 BC, Lepidus, who at this point, like I said, had fallen into a distant third behind Antony and Octavian, basically threw a Hail Mary, and he decided to just go ahead and take Sicily as his reward. Now, Octavian took that move, obviously, as an affront to the alliance between the three men. And this gives you a sense of how powerful Octavian was and how diminished Lepidus's status had become. Because Octavian didn't even fight Lepidus in a battle. He just sailed over to Sicily and he strolled into Lepidus's camp while Lepidus's soldiers just gaped and watched him walk through, Octavian went into the command tent and just stripped Lepidus of his command right there on his own authority and demoted Lepidus to a private citizen once again. He was kicked out of the triumvirate. Lepidus was then exiled to Africa, and now 3 was whittled down to 2, Octavian in the west and Antony in the east. Now with just 2 men left in charge, things got really heated. From 36 BC onward, Antony and Octavian waged a visceral propaganda war. They used all the media that were available to them: coins, statues, works of literature, and a lot of gossip to win the hearts and minds of elites and soldiers, and also to poison the reputation of their rival. So Antony, for example, accused Octavian of earning Julius Caesar's inheritance and name, not through family ties or fidelity, or even because Octavian was a promising talent, but Antony claimed that Octavian played the harlot with his own grand uncle. Yeah, you got that right. Antony was attacking the very basis of Octavian's inheritance, his name, and his right to rule. Moreover, Antony's mistress Cleopatra was mother to Caesar's biological son. Now, as an illegitimate child, the boy had no legal standing against Octavian, of course. That wasn't really the point. But Cleopatra decided to give the boy a name that left no doubt as to who his father was. The boy's name was Caesarion, or Little Caesar. Now, the Romans might never accept Caesarion as one of their own, but Antony hoped that Roman elites and Roman soldiers might be reminded that there was indeed another son of Caesar, and that this would undermine Octavian's authority back in Rome. To counter these sorts of claims, and there were many others, I'm just giving you a little flavor for the types of barbs that were thrown back and forth. To counter these claims, Octavian circulated damning stories of Antony's parties and his submission to the foreign queen Cleopatra. He even claimed that she was a kind of sorceress and a dealer in dark drugs. And many of these claims actually still survive in the literature. One of them we just saw repeated by that senator we heard from, Cassius Dio. And Octavian also argued that while Antony was gallivanting in the east with Cleopatra, he was neglecting his proper Roman wife, Octavian's own sister, back in Rome. Plutarch gives us a very sympathetic portrayal of Octavia, almost certainly a story that originally appeared as propaganda for Octavian. Quote, Octavia refused to leave the house of her husband, just as if he were at home, and she cared for his children, not only those whom she herself, but also those whom Fulvia had borne him, in a noble and magnificent manner. She also received such friends of Antony as were sent to Rome in quest of office or on business, and helped them to obtain from Octavian what they wanted. Without meaning it, however, she was damaging Antony by this conduct of hers, for he was hated for wronging such a woman. Again, Plutarch's biography of Antony. Octavian even put Octavia's head on coins, an unheard of privilege for a living woman. He wanted everyone to see the woman that Antony had rejected, a dutiful Roman wife, and Antony instead favored an Egyptian sorceress who would utterly unmanned him. Now, during this propaganda war, Antony made another of his signature blunders. With Cleopatra's help, he finally achieved a major victory in the east by 33 BC. He conquered the kingdom of Armenia, an ally of the mighty Persian Empire. Now, Antony at this point really should have taken his victorious army back to Rome and held a massive triumphal celebration there. That is what always happened normally when a general earned a victory of that magnitude. But instead, Antony stayed in the east and he held a Roman triumph in Alexandria, the very first time that such a thing had happened in a foreign city. Even worse, in the middle of the celebration and his jubilation, he impulsively passed out whole territories to Cleopatra, to his children by Cleopatra, and he had several by 33 BC, and he even awarded some Roman territory to Caesarion to rule as king. these provinces were not his. They were Rome's. And even though Antony was one of 2 co-rulers of Rome, those territories were not to be given away as gifts, especially to foreigners. The Romans themselves probably hardly believed that the claims like that could possibly be true. And modern historians would probably think that as well because of how outlandish they are, that they were made up by Octavian or his propagandists. But a really fascinating coin has survived the ravages of time to prove that Antony really did bestow such wild honors on foreigners. This coin type, which you can find on the internet by its catalog number, RRC 543-1, and I also will link to an image of this coin in the show notes. The coin shows Mark Antony's head on the one side and Cleopatra's on the other. Okay, so again, who is heads and who is tails is deliberately obscured. There's an equality that is implied between the two of them. That already is a problem. But the Latin inscription on the coin reads this. This coin is for Antony, having vanquished Armenia, and for Cleopatra, the queen of kings, and for her sons, who are kings. Now, in minting this coin, Antony played into the propaganda against him. He was recklessly giving away parts of the Roman Empire and had lost his identity as both a ruler and, frankly, as a Roman man. Even worse than this, at the same time, Antony also divorced his Roman wife, Octavia. And there was now nothing tying the two men, Octavian and Antony, together besides the law that gave the triumvirate power. And as I said, that had been renewed, but it was the next year, 32 BC, that renewal finally lapsed. And neither man attempted to get the law replaced. At this point, open war between the two men seemed imminent. It just needed a spark. Antony seemed satisfied to stay in the east with Cleopatra and rule the territories there with his new family. Octavian, however, wanted a pretext for war. And all it took to get it was just a little sacrilege. Octavian was no longer a triumvir, but he made himself dux, or leader. It's where we get the English word duke. This was a made-up position that really didn't exist in the Republican Constitution, but as leader, as dux, Octavian claimed that he had the right to break into the Temple of Vesta. And this was a building which was not just a place of worship, but it was a house for legal documents, especially the wills of many elite Romans. And that includes Antony as well. His will was in there. So Octavian obtained Antony's will, and the seal on that will was broken in public, and the document was read to Rome's senators. What did the will say? Antony was going to adopt Cleopatra's children as his legitimate legal heirs. Antony also requested that he be buried not in Rome, but in the foreign city of Alexandria. We don't know whether this will was fully or partially forged, but it gave Octavian the proof that he needed to get the Senate to agree that Antony had gone native, Antony had gone rogue, and that yet another civil war was the only solution. So in 31 BC, the Senate declared war, but they didn't declare war on Antony, but Cleopatra. So at least nominally, this was not actually another civil war, but this was a war to rescue Antony from a foreign woman who had so obviously corrupted his soul with dark magic, with deception, and perhaps some of her strange drugs. In reality, all of that, of course, was a pretext. Octavian had borne a grudge towards Antony from at least as far back as just a few months after Julius Caesar died. Over a decade earlier, Antony had insulted Octavian, and he had refused to hand over Caesar's wealth. And now, in 31 BC, payback was finally coming. It's a testament to just how unpopular Octavian still was in Rome, even though he had this declaration of war that he had wanted, that many of the senators in that city, including both of the consuls this time, actually left Rome. They abandoned Octavian, and they went over to join Antony. Octavian had got his war, but was he actually going to win it? Octavian really just solved only one problem by getting the war. It was yet another challenge entirely to actually win the thing. Octavian's general Agrippa led the war, and Agrippa was a master strategist. He had beat Pompey Sextus in Sicily, and it was not long before Agrippa had pinned Antony and Cleopatra's fleet against the coast of western Greece near the Roman colony of Actium. This was the decisive battle between the forces of Octavian on the one side and those of Antony and Cleopatra on the other. Agrippa's maneuvering of both his land army and his fleet was perfect. Antony was totally trapped and hopeless, and so Antony's soldiers began gradually to defect towards Agrippa and Octavian's soldiers. And so in a desperate move, Antony and Cleopatra just charged Agrippa's line of ships, and their ships broke through and escaped. Antony and Cleopatra fled all the way back to Cleopatra's palace in Alexandria in Egypt. Most of their fleet, however, could not outrun Agrippa's ships. With Antony and Cleopatra trapped, Octavian and Agrippa hunted them down. They eventually arrived in Egypt, and they besieged the royal palace. In a drama that Plutarch relates in detail, and of course, which Shakespeare transformed into one of the great tragedies in the history of the English language, Antony first, and then later Cleopatra, committed suicide. And we don't really know what happened other than that. Again, Plutarch makes some things up. We have other sources that suggest they know what happened, but we really don't. All we know is that within a matter of days, both Antony and Cleopatra were dead by their own hands. Octavian then put out an assassination order for Caesarion, and the boy was killed. Mark Antony's children, however, were spared. They were brought back to Rome to be raised by Octavian's family members. And the descendants of those children would end up becoming some of Rome's emperors, as we'll see later on. Meanwhile, with the death of Mark Antony, Octavian had defeated his last rival. And believe it or not, Octavian was only 33 years old at this point, in the prime of his life, and he would live another 44 years. Plenty of time to set up any kind of government that he wanted. He could become dictator for life, like his adopted father, Julius Caesar. Or he could become a king even if he wanted to at this point. Instead, he formed a new authoritarian government so cunningly disguised that many Romans really believed that Octavian had restored the Roman Republic. But unbeknownst to many, Octavian's victory inaugurated an era that the world had never before seen. A 2-century efflorescence of Roman hegemony, economic dominance, cultural expansion from the Atlantic to the deserts of the Middle East. It was a true new world order. The Pax Romana had begun.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Dr. Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.